crawling up my spine. A hip swing left, oh, and I took a breath. You play with my emotions. Don't play with my emotions. Oh.
No matter what.
I need some navigation. Don't leave me hanging. Need some application, don't leave me hanging. We returned that next week, you wouldn't even let me speak. Someone else had got you going. I turn around about face. I try to play a coolest case. You left without me seeing. I never saw her leaving. No. I need some navigation. Don't leave me hanging. Some application, don't leave me hanging.
One time, are you ready now? Ready now? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Come on, copy. Ball game me a play. Me have to reach my goal until the day the Lord free my soul. Nature moves me and make me no feel like fool. But I feel like every day we turn dreams in a reality. Work hard and me nah look no charity. Me turn dreams in a reality. The husband heal more, mommy say. Me turn dreams in a reality. I know we not do it for no vanity. Me do it for me family. So them a go hungry me now. Lord, so why complain? When every other day we a fly pan plane. In a first class seat we sipping fine champagne and wine from Spain. Deep steam chalice load up with ital strains. Same brother them you know see my friends change. You never see we sell off in no likes and fame. Remember when a baked bean and rice pan plate. No we not check no price, just pay. Every day we turn dreams in a reality. Work hard and me nah look no charity. Me turn dreams in a reality. The husband heal more, mommy say. Me turn dreams in a reality. I know we not do it for no vanity. Me do it for me family. So them a go hungry me now. Skibbly bang. If you never know how we all locked on this. Them a say the thing shot like a shotgun this. Them a family go mall and go shop down this. Not a thing you can try figure pop down this. For me children a go hand down this. Generational wealth I expand out quick. For try stop my food, me can't condone this. One time say not a song don't miss. Every day we turn dreams in a reality. Work hard and me nah look no charity. Me turn dreams in a reality. The husband heal more, mommy say. Me turn dreams in a reality. I know we not do it for no vanity. Me do it for me family. So them a go hungry me now. Lord, so why complain? When every other day we a fly pan plane in a first class.
91.3 FM, WBNY, Buffalo's original alternative, brought to you by the mandatory student activity fee here at Buffalo State.
Okay. Burkinas make history every day. Okay.
Can you read it for me?
Well, how do you say this one?
Latinas.
Burkinas make history every day. Okay.
Okay, y'all, this is another episode of Talia Talks, and we are so excited. I have two amazing people with me. I'm going to let my co-host introduce himself first, and then our guest.
Word, so what's going on, y'all? My name's Sherman Webb, Middlebrooks, lifelong Buffalo resident, full-time black man, your favorite public intellectual.
And my guest.
I'm John Kane. My Mohawk name is Gargio.
Okay, he anticipated my first question, which is, what's your name? So, John, part of what we're going to be talking about today is your amazing advocacy. And then we're also going to be talking about the ways that you share it, right? Of which I've insisted on being a guest of. I know, he said yes already. Okay, guys. So first question is, what is the name of your podcast / radio show, your platforms?
I have a podcast called Let's Talk Native, and that is exclusively a podcast. But then I have a radio show that's called Resistance Radio, and that show airs on WBAI in New York City and WPFW in Washington, D.C., and then it gets posted up as a podcast as well.
Oh, that's dope. So how did you get started and why did you get started? I'm curious.
Well, I'm not a young man anymore, but I've been a Native activist for my whole life. And at some point, I was a part of what we called a dialogue team, which we put together to really combat the state over taxation. And I had done a series of interviews on a couple of stations. And at one point, one of the local radio stations here asked me if I wanted to purchase some airtime. So I initially bought airtime on commercial radio, went from one station to another station. And then eventually I got asked to take a spot on WBAI in New York City. And then I went on to do a separate podcast and a radio show. Basically, I'm doing both at this point.
Go ahead. No, you first.
No, I was just going to say that's dope. And that's a super inspiration for me. Talia?
Wow. So you're famous. You're in DC. So how old were you when you started your podcast? If you want to tell me, and then do you want to say about yours?
I've probably been doing the podcast, and that was originally a radio show before that became a podcast, the Let's Talk Native one. I've probably been doing that for about a dozen years. So, I don't know, take 12 years away from, I'm 63 now. So I'm not like I said, I'm not a young man anymore. But before that, I was doing a lot of writing, letters to the editor. I was doing press statements and that kind of stuff as a part of the work that we were doing in fighting New York State over taxation. And that's just one of the issues, one of the Native issues that we have always found ourselves at odds with, basically government and institutions over.
Yeah, no, I think that's dope. And you mentioned your age, so that's interesting to me because I do a podcast too with my father and my little brother. It's called a Father and Sons podcast. You can check us out on YouTube, Facebook. But my dad is 63 and my little brother is 23. So and I'm right in the middle at 31. So hearing what you're talking about in terms of just being somebody who's capturing history and sharing it and disseminating it, that's really the inspiration behind what we're trying to do on our platform as well. Maybe not with some of the historical elements, but under the aspects of just storytelling. So I appreciate what you
well, and I'm a father. I've got three. My wife is Oneida. I'm Mohawk. My kids, that makes my kids Oneida. I have 10 grandchildren, the last of which was born just this past September.
Congratulations.
At my home, no less.
Wow.
So I've got 10 grandchildren, and so this, like with your father, it puts you in where you have different roles in your life,
right.
And so you play as a parent, and for me, a grandparent, But through all of it, I'm an advocate and right. I'm an activist. And the fact that I do radio and a podcast is just adding a platform for me to do that advocacy. I'm not trying to entertain.
Right.
I'm really trying to promote an issue. And some of those issues are hard fought and they take a long time. And sometimes you grab onto something and you realize that you have a strategy that's going to work. And I know one of the reasons that Talia initially talked to me was over the mascot issue.
Right.
And I'm sitting here and I'm wearing, by the way, my Caucasians t-shirt.
Can I just say how you told me you weren't going to make kitty videos? And I was like, what does that mean?
I meant kitten videos,
okay,
not kitty videos.
No, I said kitten. And I'm like, wait, I'm confused. So you meant you come onto media to advocate, but like for me, I'm also a columnist too. So I write, and my column is distributed in 4 papers across Western and Central New York because Latinos a lot have, victim of the digital divide. So very much like you and like Sherman, like definitely part of other communities where I was like, you know what, podcasting, radio. After I begged Willie and Norm to work for free for me, shout out to you guys. I was like, this is gonna be like the next chapter for me because like I'm actually the only Latina who has I'm the only radio show that's Latina driven in the 8 counties.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a huge accomplishment. I mean, and like I said, I think that I'm probably the only native voice on radio in 2 major metropolitan areas like Washington D.C. and New York, and I gotta say that I think my message is different. I'm not trying to sell my culture or my spirituality. I'm trying to talk some hard truths about history that has been buried. I tackle the tough issues like missing and murdered Indigenous women, the residential schools issues that most people have no idea even existed. The fact that,
just say what it is. Sorry, sure.
Okay, well, what residential schools were these schools that were funded by the federal government and state governments, run by churches, and they existed for 200 years essentially in U.S. history, where Native children were taken from their families, from their communities, from their nations, and the policy was kill the Indian, save the man. They were assimilation factories. They were indoctrination factories. They were torture chambers. Children died in these schools. They were raped and murdered. I would argue that the clergy sex abuse scandals that rock the news today really gained a foundation in having this unfettered access to Native kids for almost 200 years in these schools. The United States is only now beginning to reckon with it. Canada's been facing it, although poorly, but they've been. So this is one of the tough subjects that people don't know anything about. And so my job is to educate people as to what they were and to understand the scale and the scope of this policy that can only be defined as genocide.
Absolutely, definitely genocide. Couple things. So what I'm hearing, and it's making me think of the fatherhood work that I do with the Nurturing Fathers and the Engaging Fathers of Western New York, and we talk about the different roles that males play. So at first you're the boy, and then you transition out of that stage into the man stage, and then you go from the man to the patriarch, and the patriarch at that age and stage, you're really focused on legacy building, and that's what I hear, that you're focused on legacy building and making sure that generations after you know their history, because if it isn't shared, then it's going to be told by the other folks, right? The white supremacists. We're just going to go ahead and call it what it is. So, but the other follow-up that I have to that is I'm interested in your perspective, because you said that you aren't selling your culture and you aren't selling like your history, but history has been commoditized, right? And thinking about both as a full-time Black man and also you as a full-time Indigenous Native person, the show 1923 that's out on Paramount Plus, they're dealing with some aspects of the schools. What's the term?
Residential schools.
The residential
boarding
schools. The residential boarding schools, right? Where they were putting young Native kids on trains and sending them all across the country, and on steamships and things like that. And they're trying to tell a little bit of that story, and they're talking about some of the sexual abuse. I'm just interested how you feel about your history being commoditized.
Well, look, that's a challenge, because on one hand, we want our legacy, we want our stories, we want our history and our culture to be known. But the fact that it's commodified, as you say, can be problematic. And look, our identities were stolen by Hollywood for a century. I mean,
I can tell you, I know what that feels like.
I mean, so the idea that. So they get wiped out by residential schools and then hijacked by Hollywood, to the extent that even my own people look to Hollywood as part of how do we represent our identity. We only been reclaiming it for the last 50 years, really. So the idea that you have your images commodified, this gets into the mascot issue.
Right.
I mean, when you think about professional teams like the Washington football team or the Cleveland baseball team making these dopey, logos and mascots, and so the rest of America believes that that's what a Native person is. That's what a redskin is, and that word is somehow appropriate, even though it's a dictionary-defined slur. Or you've got the Kansas City football team And their name has nothing to do with Native people. I don't know if most people realize that.
Right.
The name came because the mayor, his nickname was Chief. The mayor who brought the football team to Kansas City. It had nothing to do with Native people. But you still got people in the stands that want to wear headdresses. And I analogize anybody who dresses up as a Native person, whether it's red face or a headdress, it's the same thing as blackface.
I agree.
Now, we can accept today that blackface is wrong.
Yep.
But we also have to acknowledge that it was a major part of American history. Yes. Al Jolson was the #1 entertainer in the United States at one time who made his living in blackface. And so it was widely accepted. Now it's widely condemned. I'm not going to say completely condemned, but it's widely condemned. But there's still more than half the people in the United States who think it's fine for to mock Native people. And that's a problem.
So I was telling you when we were outside, so part of my identity is that I'm Caucasian. And I was telling you, well, first I want to tell you, for the indentured servants in the schools, a lot of the persecution was about their labor. They were rented out to different farms, especially the women. So it was like this idea of the United States being able to usurp like the labor of this youth of generations and generations, but then they were paid for it. So I was like, espérate, nobody was taxing that, okay? And like, where are the numbers on that? Plus like our inflation, right? The other thing I wanted to say is, did you know they sent Puerto Ricans to those schools and we paid for it?
Well,
wait, we paid for it. I was like, you played us. Not only did you send us, they came to Puerto Rico, they advertised it like after World War I, then they sent us and we paid for it. And there's accounts of, they actually use this as an excuse. They were like, oh, different Puerto Ricans said that it wasn't that bad. And I was like, no, they did not. Wow. They did not say that. So like so much of that, for those of you who are listening who may hearing this for the first time, right, John? And this is a lot for them to process. We will post resources. And when I say we, both Sherman and I separately, right, we'll post resources and like how to process it. But also like, I think the next step too, John, is how to advocate. So I always say Orange Shirt Day. It's important, right? And then have you seen Mike Martin's documentary about the residential schools?
Yeah, the one he's featured in.
That was the first one that I actually saw. Yo, I cried.
It was a Hidden Tears, I think.
Hidden Tears. Yeah. Y'all need to watch that. Like, shout out to Mike. Big shout out to Mike. He's a West Side baby because he's on Grant.
where can we find that again?
Go ahead, John. You tell him. And then Sherman, I'm going to give you the mic.
If you search online for Hidden Tears, you can find access to the video.
Hidden Tears, okay.
So, yeah. But again, the residential schools, and when you mentioned Puerto Rican, we get into this debate on what that even means, because the people who are indigenous to Puerto Rico are indigenous people. Right. And so, in spite of all the colonization, so you were going to have brown people sent to these residential schools because there's this inability to distinguish. And of course, we're also talking about 500 indigenous nations across the continent. So the fact that we were lumped in together as Indians and then having that element, that identity stripped from us, and then having it replaced with heavy dosages of Bible and Christianity, and as you said, militarism. Essentially slavery. I mean, these kids were put into working in the fields. The girls were all taught to be housemaids, and the boys were taught to be farm laborers or learn how to march so they could enlist in the military. This was the way to destroy a people by attacking our children. And this one, I think what's important to understand is that this happened for 5 or 6 generations. So when we talk about residential schools, we can't just look at the last ones. So when you hear people say, well, yeah, my great-grandmother went to the residential schools and they weren't that bad. Some people are going to say that. Why? Because they already spoke English. They were already Christianized. They didn't have to go through the transformation that some people who didn't know a lick of English and couldn't accept this idea of having this indoctrination of spirituality being imposed upon them. So you have to look at the full picture and realize that for some people, look, it's like any kind of school, right? You got a teacher's pet. Yeah. Well, residential schools had the same thing. Those priests and nuns would make an example, and they would elevate somebody who would be very, very cooperative. But in the meantime, you had children that were raped, They were sterilized. The young girls would actually be sterilized. I mean, it was an incredible thing that most people have no real idea about.
Yeah, and it's a shame that everything you're saying is absolutely true and that it hasn't really been documented. It's also a deeper shame, I feel like, that the only point of reference that I really have to visualize what you're talking about is the 2 episodes of the show that I've seen. But I'm also even more curious about why the show's creators and writers decided to depict the Native characters in the way that they did, because they're not passive, they're not docile, they're fighting, right? And they're fighting back, but they're also showing what happened in those boarding schools when some of those women decided to fight back. But I think that is sort of inspirational, because as a Black person, we get tired of seeing like slave movies and hearing that narrative of like, oh, they was happy playing the fiddle and the banjo on the plantation and shucking and jiving. But like, who was happy during slavery, right? You know, like who would have been happy? And so
well, I love when people say, well, you have to consider the time. It wasn't as inappropriate back then. To the slave, it was. It was always inappropriate.
Absolutely. And when you talk about it generationally, I think it shows, because of that show is like the prequel to a show that's set in present time, and is exploring the relationships between the descendants of the colonizers and the Native people, right? But it's interesting to see them tell that backstory from like 100 years ago.
Well, and there's a legacy to all that. And so we live with the legacy not only of slavery,
right,
and of oppression of every marginalized group of people, but Native people have just elements of that history that still stay with us. Because even if you consider the civil rights movement, we weren't fighting for civil rights. We were still fighting for our sovereignty and our autonomy. So although we have a lot of common ground with other people, including Black people, when it comes to human rights, I'm not trying to live the American dream.
Right.
I'm not trying to grab my piece. Even Frederick Douglass, this famous abolitionist, he was all about America. I mean, and he actually was in favor of Black men who were formerly enslaved going out and taking Native lands. I mean, the Buffalo Soldiers thing, that's still about Black men being used by white men to kill Native people.
Yep.
So we get into this, it gets really, really complicated, because even though we find a lot of cooperation especially between Native people and Black people and other brown peoples. I mean,
it's just because I'm in the middle, John.
Well, no,
it's everything you're saying is true.
Well, I gotta tell you,
I'm waiting to talk about my grandma. You already know.
In the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the Black Lives Matter movement, it impacted much of our battles as well, because you saw Columbus statues being toppled right alongside Confederate statues, right? And it wasn't until that social movement that the moneyed interests finally went after Washington and said, you got to change the name.
Yeah.
You had FedEx, you had Target, you had Walmart and Amazon. They said, we're not going to carry your merchandise. So it wasn't until the social movement that brought Native people and Black people together in the wake of, and I got to tell you, most people don't know this, Native people die at a higher rate proportionally to our population than the Black people at the hands of police. It's just that the numbers are smaller, but proportionally it's higher.
So I wanted to say, John, just a couple things. One, the last boarding school that was closed was, from my knowledge, in Alaska, and that was in the 80s. Was it not?
No, there's still 5 that exist today.
I always say that the places that we house our undocumented children are those schools. Yep. Because for me, they're indigenous from Central America. And here you have people doing the same thing to them. But what I wanted to bring this back about, and not that this is what it's all about, but here I try to talk about Black and brown business. And if you talk about American economy, it was supplemented by the labor of indigenous people and the labor of my community, right?
Well, and of course by Black people.
Right. Yeah. And then people be like, oh, well, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And it's like, well, I don't have any boots. You took them. And also you want me to make yours. So as a Latina, we're so many of the Latino people, right? Because this is a very rich conversation here. So I'm tapping in. We are invisible, right? Because we're not citizens. So this whole idea of status in the United States. And like, what does that mean? And then also, what does that mean about the value of your life? I think is like almost, it's like one circular conversation, because there is a lot that happens to women who have the same name as me, but have a different citizenship status. You know what I mean?
Well, and the citizenship question is complicated too.
Well, I don't feel like it is. I feel like
because I don't want to be a citizen.
And that's okay with me. But like my whole thing is like, I feel as in the place that I live, like if you're here, no matter what your name is, no matter what Bible you pray to, etc., you need to be treated in a minimum type of way with human dignity, right? And I don't care what you call it, but you're not gonna like slave labor Latinas and then have us wanna apply for something. Like, wait, hold on. Like I always say, I spoke in front of City Hall and I said, every opportunity that we've ever asked America for, we've paid for already with our labor, right? So like, I just feel like we need to treat people.
As a black person.
Thank you.
Well,
Sherman's on the other side. I'm like, okay,
and we
Sherman's
paid
got
for it
something
with
to
our
say.
land
I feel
and
like
with our
we're-
resources.
Well, I feel like we're all the same. We too, because like as you said, in Puerto Rico, they took our land too, and that's why my grandma ended up in the caserío. My grandma's from the projects because we lost our farm.
Sure.
You know.
No, I think the whole status of Puerto Rico is
don't get me
is a debacle.
different show, John.
But,
different show, and that's going to be the one we do in Washington.
We do Hawaii too in that mix too.
Wait, I was going to say,
Go ahead,
Sherman, do you
Sherman.
want to see if Norm and Willie, do you have anything that you want to say as we are? I know Willie's going to say he's from Brooklyn, so I know he has something.
Originally from Brooklyn, New York, Buffalo, 26 years now. John, what I want to ask you, the Iroquois with the school, how do you feel about that? Them changing that.
Let me.
I want to hear that.
All right,
you want to know about that? Okay.
Let's talk about the mascots.
And then we're coming back to you. I'll just cut you off.
The ban that's now in place that was issued by the New York State Department of Education on November 17th, I believe. I made that happen. This year. I made that happen. And I'm going to tell you how. I graduated from a school called Cambridge in the eastern part of the state. That's where I went to high school. And they were the Cambridge Indians. And I graduated a long time ago, 1978. But since then, I've advocated for the mascot changes all over the country.
Right.
My school never called me. So I went back to my school and I said, you guys got to change this. And so I went in front of the school board twice. I did a petition, and that turned into a debate at my old high school. And those white folks, they dug in. I mean, they dug in. And look, 20 years ago, the New York State Department of Education issued an order that schools needed to get rid of them. 20 years ago.
Wow.
They didn't make it mandatory. They said, do it at a time that's practical. Well, many schools did. When Washington dropped its name, many schools did again. When Cleveland dropped its name, many schools did again. But some schools just dug in, and they actually expanded the uses of it. You go to my old high school, and that school was filled with images of stereotypical images of Native people, Indians all over the freaking, and it's all white people. There was one Native family that's there, and I was the only Native family at the time when I was there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the only Native family in
John, I know
town.
what that feels like. We could talk about that later too. We're so bonded.
So we fought this thing, and my deal was I knew I wasn't going to convince all those white people. But I figured a few might just drag along, and I still have some old friends, old classmates that still live there. So I figured I'd have a few that would support what I was doing, but I didn't really want that. I wanted to go after this 5-member school board and say, I only need 3. I only need 3 to change it. And the way they could deal with it is to tell the public, their public, we don't have a choice in the matter. We were asked 20 years ago to do this, and the evidence is overwhelming. The New York Association of School Psychologists, I mean the American Psychological Association, every Native organization across the country, from every nation to every organization, the National Congress of the American, every one of them have condemned this. So that's what I felt like I had to do. Well, but they were so concerned about backlash, they dragged their feet. But ultimately, 8 months after I formally asked them to change it, the school board voted to retire it, 3-2. I only had 3-2. They voted to retire it, but then the board flipped because they seated a couple of new members who ran exclusively on saving their mascot, and then they rescinded that a month later. Wow. Well, I worked with some families there, and they petitioned the New York State Department of Education to say, we want you to override the actions of the school board because it was arbitrary, capricious, and an abuse of their discretionary authority. And Dr. Betty Rosa, Latina, Dr. Betty Rosa, she went ahead and forced them to reject their rescinding resolution, and so they had to retire it. Well, Cambridge fought it. They appealed it to the state Supreme Court and lost. But now I'm changing my strategy at this point. And I know this thing is still being fought by Cambridge. They're trying to appeal the thing. But now I'm concentrating on Betty Rosa. I said, Dr. Rosa, you have the authority to change one school. You need to go after all of them.
Right.
That was her strategy, too. I didn't know that. And you know how I know that? She called me up and she told me. So
You know how we go.
So she turned around and issued a statewide ban based on the fight in Cambridge, based on the fight that I brought to Cambridge, and that's why we have it today. She was waiting. She actually told me she was waiting for a school, and she was watching this thing play out in Cambridge saying, I hope it's this school. She watches all my videos.
Well, shout out to Cambridge and the spirit of change that is coming over to your school. I know they're excited about it. John, we're looking at 5 minutes. So, Sherman, I wanted you to ask your question, and then I wanted to close out the show, but I know that you're going to have me on your show. You already committed. I think I'll be bringing Sherman. And I just want to say how excited I am to meet you and to see myself in you, because I think that, like, when I started writing, it was called Latina Herstory. It's all about, like, me curating history for my people. So I know Sherman had a question for you, and then we're going to close, okay?
All right.
So I don't necessarily think I had a question, just more of like an observation, and just a few comments. So just thinking about how we have been like classified through the eyes of the white supremacists. So like they showed up and called your people Native and Indians. They showed up and called your people Latinos, but your people were calling yourselves other names. They showed up and called my people Africans. We weren't even calling ourselves Africans or Black or Negroes. So like all of these terms that we have to describe ourselves have been given to us through the eyes and the gaze of like the white supremacists and the colonizers. So I often like to hear how people truly identify themselves and why they choose those terms. I also think that every story that you illustrated, that Talia has illustrated, that I myself has illustrated, has been just another glaring example of how the colonizers have gone throughout the world and pillaged and taken and pitted people against each other in order to do their bidding. So the same way they pitted Black folks and the Buffalo Soldiers against the natives to take their lands, they were also trying to pit the native tribes against the runaway slaves and telling them, hey, if you help us capture them, we won't bother you, but then turn around and then still take their land and subjugate
However,
them.
Native people were a big part of the Underground Railroad.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Next show,
absolutely.
we have a thing going
this is
here.
awesome.
Let me answer your
This is
question. I
awesome.
know we're running out of time.
Yeah,
I use the word native because it's benign.
okay. I appreciate that.
To the general public. But our word is ungwe ungwe.
Ungwe, ungwe.
Ungwe. And what it means is original or real human being. And that realness and originalness is tied to the land.
Right.
And so what
Right.
distinguishes an ungwe ungwe is somebody who's still on their land, still connected to their land. And that's a part of who we are. So when we say real, we mean human being in the past and in the future. So that's what our word is. So that's our word for native, I guess, is ungwe ungwe.
Ungwe, ungwe.
But when I say I'm Mohawk, that's not even the right word. I'm really Gunyagahaga. It means the people of the land of Flint.
Okay.
And when people say Iroquois, which is another word that's not ours, that's a French word.
Right.
Our word for that would be Haudenosaunee.
Yeah, that's what I'm familiar with.
Haudenosaunee. It
Right.
means the people of the way of who live by the way of the Longhouse. So those are our words. It's Ongwe Ongwe, Haudenosaunee, Gunyagahaga. But
Okay.
I do use the word native, and I will use the word Mohawk because it's the word that people are familiar with. But I oftentimes got to qualify it. So
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
Sure.
Shout out to Gardo Hodaibo, who was the only kid that would stand up for me on the bus, who was also Mohawk. John, thank you so much for coming. Sherman, thank you for coming. What I really wanted to create was just like a space where we talked about identities, but then really underscoring what our people's economic contribution to the American economy has been. I think we've done this in the short time. I do think that there's some natural synergy here and some topics we may need to come back to.
You guys need to come back again.
Let's do it.
Yeah, so
Anytime.
thank you. This was another episode of Two Favorite Morning morning show, Talia Talks, and these two amazing men that are on either side of me. Please follow them and listen to their voices and lift up other people like them. And John, do you want to close the show for us?
Well, all I got to say is we need to empower the youth. I mean, there are guys like me who are, in the twilight of our activism, so to speak. And we really need to empower the youth. Anybody who criticizes young people, I don't think they can appreciate that they are going to carry the torch as we hand it off. And we need to hand it off. So we need to equip them, we need to arm them, and we need to encourage them. So.
Good job. We killed it.
Great show,
and there's
great
a
show.
lot that I have to say.
Burkinas make history every day. Okay.
Can you read it for me?
Well, how do you say this one?
Latinas.
Burkinas make history every day. Okay.